Okay, that just got weird. I didn't sign on for this.
Accusations!
These are not accusations. This is
False accusations.
And
Chapter 35. Conrad. I would rather have someone shoot me in the head with a nail gun repeatedly than—
It's good to see you again, Kent. You sick piece of shit. Such unfortunate language. Only those who cannot express themselves intelligently would resort to such crude substitutions in voice.
Someone needs to answer me this, because how the fuck can I read a 300,000 word AO3 fan fiction, but I can't read 20 fucking pages of a book for class? The fuck?
She was absurdly petite, so petite that her bones could hardly hold her up. But she regularly killed grizzly bears to feed her family. Her hair wasn't quite blonde brunette, but it had an auburn sheen, and her eyes were gigantic and green, but sky.
Because it's not the spice that gets you in public. You can read spice with a completely blank face. That is a skill long developed for most of the BookTok peoplesies, either from fanfiction or from many other books. It's not the spice that gets you. It's the fluff. It's the pinkies touching. It's the eye intensity. It's the hand on the shoulder. It's the longing glance. It's the declarations of love that you just can't contain anymore. That's what has you breaking in public, not the spice. Spice is not the problem. It's the fluff.
So this is for all of my BookTok people. I was just at Barnes & Noble and I bought a lamp. This is the lamp. Get ready. It's so freaking cool. I love it. And you can just lay it flat. You could put it upright and like partially open. And it has different warmths. So there's like a cool tone and a mid-tone. And this is not sponsored. I am just so excited. I don't know if anybody else knew this existed, but I am in love. And boom, closed. And it's chargeable and portable. So you can just take it with you and you got magic book light.
This is such a good point, and one that I've been thinking about a lot recently, because I'm on fanfic and fandom TikTok, right? But that means that I will occasionally end up on BookTok, and like, that's super cool. Love it. It's great. But there's one person, one author in particular, who starts a lot of their videos by saying, oh, if you're not a spicy romance reader, like, don't watch this video, you don't want to get traumatized. And so I saw that, and I was so curious, because I was like, what could you possibly be talking about that would require this warning based on past experience? It was DP. It was DP. And at that moment, I realized that fanfic authors and people who read fanfiction are simply just another breed.
Here's everything that you should know before you decide if you want to pick up Playground by Erin Beauregard. The reason that I'm making this video is because since I've been making videos about this book, more videos about it have been popping up on my For You page, and I've come to the realization that there are actually a lot of people that have picked up this book and not quite realized what they were getting themselves into because they didn't do the proper research on it and ended up either traumatizing themselves and or being really angry with the author for not giving the proper trigger warnings before they picked the book up. So here's everything that you should know before you decide if this is a book that you should buy and or read. Before we get started, this video will not contain any spoilers for this book. We will be briefly touching on what happens on the infamous page 40, but that still is not considered to be a spoiler because, one, it happens on page 40 of like a 330-page book, which is still pretty early on for it to be considered a true spoiler, and number two, what happens on page 40 actually has nothing to do with the plot of this book. So if you're worried about being spoiled, no need. The first thing that you should know before picking this book up is that this is not your average horror book, okay? This book actually falls into a subgenre of horror called splatterpunk. You can Google it if you want to learn like the technical terms for what splatterpunk means, but it basically is the worst of the worst horror, okay? So think of like the worst horror book you've ever read, times it by 100, take 5 more steps, and you probably still aren't there with how bad a splatterpunk book can get. Now, from what I've heard, this is actually pretty tame in comparison to other splatterpunk novels, so you should definitely be doing your research whenever you are considering to pick up a splatterpunk book because they will get to really bad places that you can't even imagine. The second thing that you should know, and this is pretty much the only other thing, there's really only two things about this book that you should know, and we're already on the second one, and that is that what happens on page 40 doesn't have anything to do with the plot of this book. Because I think the thing that happens when people hear about this book is that they hear the premise of it, which is like Saw meets Squid Game, but for children. So they hear like violence with children. Okay, I've read The Hunger Games, I've watched The Hunger Games, that's kind of the same concept, but let me tell you right now, the descriptions that are in this book are nothing compared to something that you would read in like one of the Hunger Games books, okay? But still, even then, I think people hear about this book, they hear the plot of it, and then they hear page 40 is so horrible that people stop reading. But they think, oh, I can handle that because it has to do with, you know, saw traps. But what happens on page 40 doesn't have anything to do with the premise of this book, okay? So I'm going to tell you essentially what happens on page 40 as best as I can with TikTok's terms and policies, okay? So page 40 does not have to do with the violence of children or anything like that. It actually has to do with a non-consensual sexual scene, okay? Involving a very old lady, her sort of adopted son, and also throw up. Okay, so that's what happens on page 40. What happens on page 46 is even worse. Not a lot of people talk about page 46 because they probably stop reading after page 40 and don't actually realize that it gets worse. To be completely honest with you, once you get past page 40 and 46, even though this book continues to be extremely violent, gory, and descriptive, it's kind of a walk in the park in comparison to page 40 through 46, okay? So in conclusion, two things that you should know about this book. One, do your research on splatterpunk and how bad it can get. Number two, you know what page 40 is about. You are entering this book at your own risk. Now, there is something to be said about like the responsibility of authors and giving trigger warnings. That's a topic for another day. I'd be happy to do a video about it, about my opinion on whether authors are responsible for giving trigger warnings or not. But for now, that is what I will leave you with. Do your research. You're entering this book at your own risk. Good luck.
It's like a reward.